So I'm going to talk about the role of hydrogen within the construction industry. And yeah, I'm basically going to go through some of our developments within the business over the last few years around the use of hydrogen within a few of our different production processes. So just a real quick intro on why hydrogen really. So as most people probably know, we're a global organisation, and particularly three aspects of our business are very carbon intense. So there's the cement production, which there's lots of information on the stand on how we're decarbonising cement. We've also got our asphalt plants, which again are very carbon intensive, and then we've also got our GGBS plants, which are equally as carbon intensive as some of our asphalt plants. So what do we do in the UK? So we're a supplier of choice for nuclear power stations, so we supply a lot of materials for critical UK infrastructure. And yeah, we also supply material for green energy projects such as solar and wind. And yeah, we're also a leading supplier for UK infrastructure in terms of HS2 highways, etc. So quite an interesting concept we've come up with is it's called closed loop decarbonisation, whereby ultimately if we can make low carbon materials which can be then fed into manufacturing facilities which could then produce renewable energy and hydrogen, and obviously that can be fed back into the process, which is quite a neat concept on how we can also support our own decarbonisation as a business. So, as some people might know about hydrogen, there's a lot of colours, and I'm not going to try and baffle you with all the colours of hydrogen. It's called the hydrogen rainbow. You can look it up on Google if you're interested. But just four real key areas which we've been looking at in terms of where we get hydrogen supply for the business is firstly hydrogen from natural gas. So the two colours of hydrogen from natural gas. First one, which is called grey hydrogen, which is very carbon intensive. But then there's also blue hydrogen, which is made via the same process, but we also use carbon capture and storage to then make a low carbon blue hydrogen. However, if you move towards the right hand side of the page, this is where we really want to be at. So I guess the pinnacle for us in terms of low carbon hydrogen would be to use what's called green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is made from renewables, add water, which then makes green hydrogen. And then something we've also looked into, which is quite interesting, is the potential of pink hydrogen. So the real key thing about potentially looking at how we can use pink hydrogen is the fact that nuclear can produce at scale, at serious scale. And we need a lot of hydrogen to try and decarbonise our industry, but also with us here in the UK. So, a few challenges we usually get asked about, to be honest, around, so why hydrogen? So I think a key thing for us is that we know electrification can work. However, for some of our processes, it's quite challenging. So our cement kilns require a serious amount of heat in order to operate, the equivalent to running 3,000 home boilers per hour, which is a really significant number. So as you can imagine, in order to electrify some of our cement process, it's going to be very expensive, and we're going to require very significant upgrades to the grid, which is already very tightly constrained here in the UK. So that's one of the challenges, and that's why we think hydrogen could be a really good lever versus electrification. Another key thing around if we wanted to use electricity is a lot of our processes, particularly asphalt, it has quite a very fluctuating demand profile throughout the day. Therefore, you'd end up having to hugely increase the grid capacity to kind of iron out them peaks and troughs, which again, very, very challenging in an already very tight constrained grid in the UK. So just moving on a little bit around, alternative products. So we already supply lower cementitious materials here into the UK business. However, it all comes down to cement is potentially still required for a lot of these mixes which we make for concrete. So again, alternative products from that perspective is quite challenging. When we go back to asphalt, there are developments. So you can look at using lower carbon binders, you can use lower carbon bitumen, but ultimately heat is still required in order to make asphalt workable. And if asphalt's not workable, then you basically haven't got any product. So again, that's why we say hydrogen is a decarbonisation lever, potentially for some of our asphalt plants. So just another couple of options. So as a UK business, we're also looking at biofuels. However, I think there's a lot of challenges around biofuels. So firstly, quality can be quite inconsistent, which is challenging, particularly for our cement business line. But I think, yes, another key thing for us is sustainable sourcing. So it's all well and good using some HVOs to kind of offset some of our fossil fuel use, but you've got to really look into that whole value chain of carbon, because sometimes it's not quite as good as what people think. And obviously carbon capture, big topic today for pretty much the whole stand is, carbon capture, we know it's going to work, definitely for cement, and the reason for that is, up to 70% of our emissions from making cement come from the raw materials. The other 30% are fuels. So hydrogen might be able to decarbonise that other 30%, but we've still got to get rid of this 70% regardless. And I think carbon capture, we've started looking at for some of our asphalt plants, but the challenge is size. It's really hard to scale carbon capture for some of our small operations like asphalt. So again, that's why we think hydrogen will be a really good decarbonisation lever for making asphalt. So the question is, what have we done? Well, we've actually done quite a lot really over the last few years. So I think our hydrogen journey really started back in 2019 and 2021. So we actually carried out the world's first ever trial of using hydrogen within the cement production process, which was very successful. We used it as basically a blend of hydrogen and some other biofuels, and we basically managed to make cement as we know it today with no quality issues using hydrogen, which is really positive. So our next thing, we're starting to look at, well, how can we potentially look at making our own hydrogen on site? So we basically looked at some small scale generation units at 2 of our cement works in the UK. Again, successful trials, but still very, very expensive to make this kind of hydrogen on site at very small scale. So moving on to another similar generation project is that one of our GGBS plants, we collaborated with Swansea University, and they basically provided us with some really innovative technology to make hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen quite cheaply. So again, we did some trials there and we demonstrated that it's absolutely possible. We directly fed the hydrogen into our natural gas system without any issues. Very, very positive. So moving on to our more current work, which is ongoing now in North Wales. So back in 2023, we started a feasibility study in our asphalt business, and looking at how we can decarbonise one of our asphalt operations. That feasibility study was very successful. Now we've moved into phase 2 of that. So that's a government-funded project as well, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. Then back in 24, we kind of revisited some of the stuff we did in cement, and we looked at how we could potentially use green ammonia as a hydrogen carrier rather than using hydrogen directly. Because one of the challenges with using hydrogen, as some of you may know, it's very light, so the transport cost can significantly outweigh basically the total package cost of hydrogen, which makes it real challenging for us. So we've done a feasibility study looking at how we could potentially use green ammonia as a hydrogen carrier, which that's concluded this year, and we're going to disseminate most of the learnings this year on that. So then moving on to one of the big projects now, which is kind of ongoing, is we are now looking to do the UK's first hydrogen trial at one of our asphalt plants. So that project's well on track for project delivery at the back end of 25. And I guess the future for us at the moment is kind of looking at all these learnings, and we're starting to pull together some kind of hydrogen strategy for the business so we can really start making a pull in the supply chain of hydrogen. So I'm hoping the video audio should work. So here's basically a video giving us a brief overview of what we're doing at Criggan in terms of hydrogen for our asphalt project.
We're here at Criggan today, and this is going to be a UK first in terms of potentially using hydrogen as a fuel to make asphalts. And in asphalt production, one of our biggest carbon emitters is obviously the fuel we use to heat the aggregates. So for us, we're really looking now at innovations about how we decarbonise that. So for us, we see hydrogen as one of the options potentially that we can use to replace natural gas in our asphalt production.
It's stone that's heated up. We put a bitumen to it. There's different grades of bitumen, but that's based on whatever the requirement is. So what you're standing on now is an asphalt. You drive on it every day, so your motorway services, your footpaths, tennis courts, loads and loads of different applications for the product. So right behind me there's a rock face, and what we do there is we'll extract materials from that rock face by a drilling and blasting process. The product then is put onto vehicles, the big articulated dumpers, brought down into the secondary area then for a crushing process. The crushing process then will crush it all down to a size that we require for our production and for aggregates production requirements as well.
Hydrogen Materials have got clear ambitions to be net zero by 2050. We've got our 2030 commitments, which are our short-term aims and goals. For us, it's about working collaboratively. We know we can't do this by ourselves. We've got to work with our customers, we've got to work with our supply chain, and fundamentally, we all work together as a collaborative industry. I think we will actually achieve net zero goals that everyone's got.
So that was basically an overview of our project at Griggan, whereby, so it's under the government, so it's the second phase of the feasibility study that we've now gone into phase 2B, where we're going to look at basically using green hydrogen as a total replacement for some of our fossil fuels on site. So hopefully the subtitles give you a bit of context around that project as an update. So just moving really on to the final slide, it's kind of where we see hydrogen going in the future for us as a business. So we've kind of split this into basically 3 pillars. So in terms of single-use applications, we're fairly sure at some point, depending on the price point which we can get hydrogen to, it will be used as a fuel enhancer rather than a direct fuel replacement within the cement making process. We're trialling this now to prove that it can be a direct fuel replacement for fossil fuels within asphalt. We're also looking at how we can potentially decarbonise some of our really big yellow mining equipment. And then obviously, probably some people have probably read in the press recently around developments of using hydrogen to decarbonise HGVs and the road fleet in general in the UK. So we've wanted to take them single opportunities a bit further. So we've explored what we class as wider opportunities. So in the UK, we're quite a large owner of land. So we could have the possibility of looking at larger on-site generation using renewables to make our own green hydrogen, which we could then directly feed into our manufacturing processes. We've also got the opportunity to look at maybe developing hydrogen hubs for our fleet. We've got more than 3,000 delivery vehicles in the network at any one time, so that's a possibility. Another interesting concept which we're trying to explore is looking at how we can use CCS but make that CCU. So instead of carbon capture and storage, looking at carbon capture and utilisation. So potentially some of our CO2, maybe from our cement plants, could be combined with hydrogen to make the likes of e-methanol or basically classed as e-fuels. And I guess one of the big ones for us in terms of driving costs down is how we can get connection to the UK gas network, which at some point could transition into hydrogen, which is really interesting. So pulling all this together, we've come up with a bit of a hydrogen vision. So I think the vision for us as a business long term would be looking at integrated sites whereby we have renewables and water harvesting, which we can then feed into an on-site electrolyser, whereby we can make hydrogen to decarbonise asphalt production, aggregates mobile plant, also have HGV refuelling on site, and obviously future opportunities is probably looking at maybe co-location of some of our other sites into like more industrial clusters as a long-term aim. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll now open up to any questions that anyone's got.